and so we can proceed with our topic, which is an unusually complex one. Most of you are, of course, aware that there is a great deal of mounting excitement and attendant confusion taking place in connection with the approaching third millennium of the era after Christ, because with the coming of the year 2000, obviously we will inaugurate the third 1000 years or the third millennium, and so the concern for the future is taking on a certain intensity. We spoke of this, of course, before. Millennial anxiety is definitely present in our world, as indeed is what might be called millennial arrogance. The anxiety is, of course, manifesting in all kinds of doomsday scenarios, while the arrogance, of course, manifesting in the notion that soon Christ will return, or the Jewish Messiah will come, or perhaps the two will be the same. They were the same at one time, so I understand. And then, of course, various groupings of the elect, elected by themselves, of course, which is one of the surest ways to get elected, will have a much better time than all the rest of us, or maybe even than they had before. In regarding the doomsday scenarios, of course, regarding the terrible and cataclysmic expectations, there is certainly one that has been sort of unexpectedly, and at least from our point of view, happily removed from the scene, and that, of course, was the expected nuclear confrontation of the then two superpowers, the United States and the now happily well, what should we call it, the sort of happily collapsed Soviet Union. So that wonderful expectation, which was so much in people's minds really for so long that it was accepted as a virtual certainty by many, is no longer with us. Still, other bogeymen and images of menace are available and no doubt will continue to be utilized. Global warming, the melting of the ice cap or ice caps, since there are two of them, titanic earthquakes, the sinking of continents, the colliding of the earth with objects from outer space. These are only a few of the dire prospects that people envision as pertaining to the future, perhaps even to the near future. Much more muted and much more unfashionable than a couple of decades ago, there are expectations of the opposite nature, of a new age of Aquarius, characterized by all sorts of good things, including universal justice and human brotherhood. How soon the trends and the fashions passed. It seems but yesterday that so many people sang and, more importantly, actually took seriously the words, "When the moon is in the seventh house and Jupiter aligns with Mars, then peace will guide the planets and love will steer the stars." This is the age of Aquarius, the age of Aquarius, Aquarius. Harmony and understanding, sympathy and trust abounding, no more falsehood or derisions, golden living, dreams of visions, mystic crystal revelation, especially that one, and the mind's true liberation, Aquarius, Aquarius. How distant today seems that song, and how far removed from us the mindset that gave rise to it. Upon deeper inquiry, we may also find, however, that the two extremes, the apocalypticist alarm concerning the end of the world and the vision of the golden living dreams of Aquarius, are moved by a perception of the end of something that we have held in high esteem for a long time. What I refer to is the end of history, or at least of history as we have come to know it. And soon I will place this particular item into, let's say, a position of proportion with the other scenarios which I will enumerate for you. But right now, let me just very briefly allude to this. The importance of history, and even the recognition that there is such a thing in a, well, how should I put it, in an other than incidental and illusory fashion, is to a major extent unique to the civilizations that grew out of the Mediterranean matrix and out of the monotheistic religious family or family of religions, namely Zoroastrianism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And the reason for this being that history or historical time has really only been taken seriously by these particular people and these particular civilizations. This may be difficult for us to accept, but it is true. Once again, the truism that highly abstract metaphysical and even theological concepts and doctrines lie at the back of the thinking of all civilizations without exception is revealed by this circumstance. This also is difficult for us to envision because at least we ourselves here in the West and in the uttermost West where we find ourselves, because you know, if you go much farther west than California, then you end up east. So kind of this is the point of enantiodromia, geographically speaking, where the West ends up changing into the East. But let's say in the West, contemporary West, we live in a highly secularized culture, or at least so it seems to us. And therefore it's difficult for us to accept that the underpinnings of the thinking of our culture have religious origins. Many would not like this at all. But whether we like it or not, it is something that we cannot get away from. And so our concept of time and of, let's say, history within time or historical time is grounded in the idea that the world within which we live and we with it have all been created at a particular time in history, and well, let's say at the beginning of history, at the point when history began, from then on historical time sort of continues like a great big long line in which every portion of the line, every historical incident is substantially and essentially different from every other. They may have certain similarities, but they are unique. And that this line in turn, even as it had a beginning at one time, will come to an end. And that will be the end of time. It will be the end of history, and the end of the world, and possibly the end of ourselves, at least as we know ourselves. This is a monotheistic notion of the Judeo-Christian, Islamic, and possibly Zoroastrian religious matrix. Now, however, very, very quickly, in fact, I think what I do is I'll better I better give you a little outline right now within which these considerations then will make sense. Let's get ahead of ourselves a little bit and say that within the existence, human and otherwise, and we'll come back to that a little bit later on, no matter how time is envisioned, no matter how history is accepted or not accepted, there are certain existential realities which everyone accepts because they constantly impinge upon the individual's consciousness. And one of these is, for instance, the essentially frustrating, unsatisfactory nature of earthly life and the suffering attendant upon it. This is something that cannot be escaped. Everyone is confronted with it all the time. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone reacts to it in the same fashion, that everyone has the same kind of attitude toward it, or that everyone has the same explanation for it, or that everyone, and this is most germane to our concern, has the same, or feels he has the same solution to it. But it is there. People have always recognized that there is a lot of misery and there are a lot of problems in earthly life. And now this universal recognition, this existential recognition then has evoked certain responses. It has been approached by people, past and present, in the following principal ways. First, there is a reaction which is very common to our culture, especially, well, let's say since the Renaissance. And that is the reaction which might be characterized by the sentence, let us fix the problem, let us fix the suffering. And how do we go about that? Well, in all kinds of ways. If we have pain in our body, physical pain, we apply medication to it. When we have psychological pain, we generally we invent feel-good philosophies which we think are going to take that pain away. And on the larger scale, we devise social and political schemes to take care of various painful problems. The observation which I think one can make with a considerable degree of justification, that the results of all such approaches, as we have just mentioned, of all such schemes are of necessity temporary, or they are part of what the Buddhists call impermanence. Because certainly if we have a chronic painful condition, painkillers wear off, and then the pain is there again. When we devise for our own satisfaction feel-good philosophies, they can affect our minds only for a period of time, and then they usually break down. The relief and sometimes even the euphoria that comes with such notions as, let me just sort of indicate what I mean. Well, for instance, the kind of philosophies that say that all you have to do is think positively, and then your life is going to be positive altogether. And then you find out that you have been thinking positively for a long time, and your life is positively miserable. Either again, or that it never ceased to be positively miserable. So the results of the feel-good scheme didn't work out. Social and political schemes similarly obviously have their limitations and are part of that impermanence. And we have had some very powerful examples of that in our just past century, but even earlier we have seen that they have all broken down. The two most powerful perhaps having been Hitler's 1,000-year Reich, which lasted less than 20 years, and the happily ill-fated Soviet Union, which has also come to its demise. So the notion that the way to approach suffering and the existential difficulties of earthly life is to try to fix all problems is obviously not a satisfactory one. For this reason, primarily, I think it has been pretty much restricted to the last few hundred years of the history of Western civilization, really. Another answer to these existential problems, this is the second one, has been, another set of answers have been precisely the end-time scenarios, some of which we have been talking about in past talks and so forth. Why? Because one way to envision the ending of our unsatisfactory condition here on earth is to see the whole doggone thing come to an end. Obviously, when the world ends and our earthly lives end with it, then all of that is going to end too. So one way to see human and perhaps animal misery end is for the world to come to an end. Simple thinking and a simple solution. Here we have two main categories. One are the actual end-time scenarios or apocalyptic scenarios, such as the one that you'll probably hear most about this year and for a while to come, which is kind of a Christian notion, but I think most vociferously espoused by a segment of Christianity, which of course tends to feel that no one but it is Christian. I think one of the height of the arrogance of evangelical and fundamentalist Christianity is that it calls itself Christian and will not accord that same name to other portions of Christendom. I think it's absolutely awful. So that when you hear on the radio or television those things, I am a Christian, the people who say that are almost without exception evangelical Christians and fundamentalists. And if someone, they will not accord a Catholic or an Eastern Orthodox, or whole number of other people the privilege of being Christian, yet there wouldn't be any evangelical Protestant Christians if first there hadn't been Catholics and Eastern Orthodox. Where the heck do they think they came from? Do they think they were dropped from an evangelical flying saucer? They grew out of these pre-existing ones, but they are the only Christians. Well, enough ranting about that. But let's say in these circles, this is the scenario, and this is what you are going to hear. This is the sequence, actually. First comes the Antichrist. And of course, if you have heard the latest pronouncements of that outstanding gentleman, the Reverend Jerry Falwell of Lynchburg, Virginia, then you know, of course, that the Antichrist is already in the world and that he's a Jewish male. So there you are. In any event, first comes the Antichrist. Then comes the great battle of Armageddon. Then comes, closely combined with that, the second coming of Christ. Because if the Antichrist is here, the real one can't be far behind. That is followed by the victory of the good forces over the Antichrist and by the millennium, or the 1,000-year rule of Christ. Which then is followed by the last judgment and the actual end of the world and of time. This is the sequence, lest you be confused by all the prophetic material that is floating around. So this is the grand paradigm of sort of the extreme wing of Christendom. And then there is another end-time scenario that it comes actually primarily out of the secularist mentality of the last couple of centuries, and that is not the end of the world, but the end of history. The end of history scenarios, such as those envisioned by the Marxists on the one hand, and I'll talk about them these things briefly in a few minutes, and the neo-Hegelians on the other hand. To put it very, very, very quickly at this point, what this means is that in the view of some of these people, and this is a kind of a 19th century notion, that in turn was, I think, influenced by the evolutionary concept originated by Darwin, that history is moving toward something. And this something then is really the end of history, because after that there is no more development. So here you should understand history as a kind of evolution. And then history evolves to a certain desirable end, and then it's going to stop. That's the way things are going to stay. According to the Marxists, when the ultimate rule of the proletariat is established, that great happy thing for which millions had to be slaughtered and which never came, then there is the end of history. With the neo-Hegelians, it's something a little bit different. That is the other notion. The earlier one is of supernatural connections, namely the evangelistic Christian ones, while this one that I just mentioned is worldly or secularistic. If one is looking for symbolic truth rather than a literal interpretation, then a certain amount of symbolic truth may be found in the former, but certainly not in the latter, in my view. The third way in which people have approached this existential condition is quite different, because this comes from the matrix where historical time does not exist. Literally is not a consideration. It comes from what Mircea Eliade called the refusal of history, or the myth of the eternal return. Needless to say that these are not of Western origin, but primarily relate to the thought of ancient India. This matrix of thought also has two aspects. The first relates to the idea of vast cosmic spiritual cycles. Now you always have to remember, talking about cycles, that cycle comes from the Greek word kyklos, which means a circle. Cycle, circle. Therefore, a cycle denotes a circular concept of time, where in some fashion or the other things always return to their origins. All right? Now, what are often called the Brahmanical chronologies, which are sort of the chronological speculations or chronological doctrines of the ancient Hindus. There are vast periods of times that are envisioned, cycles within cycles, very, very big ones extending for millions of years. I mean, these people talked about millions of years when we still thought that the entire creation of the world was a few thousand years, such as Manvantaras, Kalpas, Yugas, and so forth. The Yugas being the ones that are the least numerous in years. And here, for instance, it is envisioned that the present cycle within which we find ourselves, which extends for thousands and thousands of years, is the so-called Kali Yuga, the Dark Age, named after the dark sort of chthonic ambivalent goddess Kali. And in the Kali Yuga, things are said to be of a very material, very heavy, very dark nature. These ages pass, and eventually everything goes into non-manifestation, and then begins a new vast cycles again. So you can sort of envision this as a cosmic or super cosmic kind of cycles of the reincarnation of the worlds. The second aspect of this thinking relates to what is called karma, which in Sanskrit means action, wherein the causes of these existential evils that we are talking about, all the various forms of suffering, physical and spiritual, are slowly minimized within a reincarnational process, or at least so it is envisioned. Westerners, I think, often have accepted these doctrines, but almost of necessity in a sort of reduced, cheapened and bowdlerized fashion. So that I think the manner in which people talk about karma nowadays here, or even reincarnation here, is very, very different from the original concepts in ancient India. And the Mircea Eliade, for instance, suggests in his work on the myth of the eternal return that perhaps these doctrines actually may have been devised for the purpose of leading the individual to the recognition of a need for total liberation. So that when the person looks at these vast, incredible schemes, if he is bright enough, which most Westerners are not, when they look at these things, then he gets to say, oh my word, I've got to get out of this. So that the need, the desire for liberation increases the more you see the vastness of these cyclical schemes. Interesting idea. Mircea Eliade was a very smart old Romanian. So that is indeed a strong possibility. Now, actually, liberation, not within the cycles and within karma, but so to say outside or beyond these cycles, that is the last and to me the most satisfactory approach. This approach was represented in ancient India by the various forms of yoga philosophy. It really represents the rationale behind yoga philosophy, and here I think also we tend to forget what these were all about. I mean, I don't just mean that we think that yoga are the physical exercises that you will do in a studio somewhere in Beverly Hills, probably, I don't know, located over a furrier's shop, or whatever the case, just for contrast, you know. And then the people won't know whether they are demonstrating for yoga or against the furrier or what's going on. But anyway, you know, not the physical exercises, but even other people, we have come to assume that our, well, how should I put it, our corruptions, our reductions of these various ancient systems and their ideas, the personalistic ends to which we try to twist them, are their essence and their rationale. Again, incredible arrogance. And arrogance is often combined with stupidity, and I think in this case that is ignorance, arrogance. They even rhyme, you know. And so, you know, we think that the yogas are here to either make us physically healthier, and then we stop there. Of course, yes, certain yoga systems may have been designed in part to do that, but you know why? So that when you engage in prolonged spiritual exercises, your body is not going to start hurting and giving you trouble and draw your attention back to itself. That's why they are there. Not to make some businessman in Beverly Hills or somebody else be a little bit healthier to conduct his business. And conversely, they were not designed to sharpen our minds for our egotistical purposes, to teach us how to concentrate so that again we can make more money or whatever else we may want to do. And of course we do the same thing with Buddhist meditation and everything. We twist it to our purposes. We are perhaps not the only ones to do that. I think that there are some examples, for instance, of Zen Buddhism having been somewhat twisted to the purposes of the samurai class in Japan at certain historical period. But at least the Japanese did it with a certain subtlety and elegance, which are not common features in our culture at all. And there's something to be said for that. If you are going to do something nasty, at least do it subtly and elegantly, please, you know. If you must, and I guess we all must at some time or the other in our lives, don't we? But the yoga systems, all 7 of them, 7 major ones and a whole bunch of them, have all one objective. What is that? Liberation from earthly existence. Liberation from earthly existence and nothing else. Everything else is incidental and accidental to that. Why? Because the old Hindus have found out that they are living in a prison. Their prison is a bit larger, perhaps, than ours, because it extends for these millions of years of cycles of all the kalpas and mahakalpas and mahamanvantaras. But you know, the big prison is pretty bad, too, just like a small prison. So the issue is to rise out of this prison. In fact, such terms as kaivalya, moksha, nirvana, which later on was used so extensively by the Buddhists, for instance, which are all terms indicating freedom, liberation, awakening from the existential condition. These were all used in the yoga philosophies already by people like Patanjali and Shankara and all kinds of people for a long time, even before the coming of Buddhism. Now what you need to remember is that this is liberation not within time, but from time. Not the curing of suffering at its own level, but rising above it and out of it. Now just what kind of an interpretation you give to this notion of rising above the causes of suffering, rising above suffering, rising above karma, overcoming karma, attaining to karmalessness, because of course the Hindu notion would be that when action, activity of consciousness in the world ceases, then karma ceases. When karma ceases, then there is nothing holding the individual consciousness in its existential condition any longer. And sort of the wheel has stopped, and therefore you can get off. The two greatest representatives actually of this attitude, however, are not really Hinduism as it became later on, but Buddhism and Gnosticism. Buddha came along, of course, out of the Indian matrix because he found apparently that the existing efforts toward liberation of the yogis in his time didn't work. They were not effective, and so he pursued this effort, really the same, having the same objective as the yogis, but at least he and the Buddhists felt and feel more effectively. And in an area somewhat removed, of course, from India, over in the Mediterranean matrix, the Gnostics pursued the same. Both of these schools feel that there are also conscious agencies that have a vested interest in maintaining the wheel of birth and death and the cycle of suffering, and that these have to be overcome or addressed. Now I know that the Gnostics, probably ancient and modern, are a little more forthright about this, And as we will little later on, I'll read you really the one and only, I think, sort of end time passage in the Gnostic scriptures, and you will see therein that the Gnostics speak of these rulers and archons, spiritual, of which Saint Paul speaks as spiritual wickedness in high places, who are involved in preserving the existential condition and the enslavement of consciousness within that condition. If you listen to the contemporary Buddhists, you usually don't hear much about it. But as such people as Jung, Heinrich Zimmer, who was of course an associate of Jung's, Joseph Campbell, who was a student of Heinrich Zimmer, and people like that have informed us, particularly Zimmer, who I think was a great genius along these lines. At a certain point, it is not enough to read or study or listen to the religious exhortations of a tradition at the prosaic verbal exhortative level, but you have to look at the mythological dimension, that there are certain truths that are disclosed in mythic form which are not disclosed in declarative prosaic form, and then you get the complete picture. I don't think there's very little doubt about that. If you study Hinduism, you know, almost everywhere, what is one of the very first things that people will give you to read is the Bhagavad Gita. What is the Bhagavad Gita? Bhagavad Gita is not a compendium of doctrines, but it is a particular portion of a vast mythic cycle of the Mahabharata. But in portions of the Mahabharata, for instance, such as the Bhagavad Gita, there is a tremendous amount of spiritual teaching. So here too, what you need to look at, for instance, is the life of Buddha, the story of Buddha's life. And you see there then that at the very eve of his enlightenment, when he sits already under the Bodhi tree, somebody comes along, Mara, the deceiver, who parades his hosts of all sorts. There is a movie, isn't it called The Little Buddha? Bertolucci, where interwoven with a contemporary story, there are wonderfully staged scenes of the life of Buddha, which sort of take you through the major events of the life. And the scene of the enlightenment is fabulous. One after the other, these deceptive images, both alluringly pleasant and awfully terrifying, vast armies that come and shoot fiery arrows, gigantic tidal waves of water coming along, and the Buddha just sits absolutely quietly and serenely under the tree without moving a muscle. And then he perceives Mara's face looking out of the pool of water in front of him, and Mara rises out in wrath before he couldn't terrify the Buddha. And the Buddha looks at him and addresses him with a curious word which is supremely Gnostic. He calls him architect. Architect. You will no longer build the house, you know. And the architect comes very close to the Greek word demiurgos, the craftsman builder. He who has built the world, builds the illusions, builds everything in which we move around and function and sit. So the reason I mention this is because even though people, especially Western people, would like to make an abstraction out of Buddhism, even as they have tried to make an abstraction out of Hinduism for a long time and so forth. Why? Well, first of all, because we have sort of gotten into a mode of thinking over the last 200-300 years, that abstractions are much more valuable somehow than anything else. The mind loves, of course, abstractions. But there's another reason. Why is that? Because with abstractions, you don't really have to do anything. In fact, you can't do anything with an abstraction. An abstraction exists to be held in the mind. That's it. And we love it. Why do we love it? Because we don't have to do anything about it. Perhaps that interesting fellow Colin Wilson is right after all, who said in one of his books that our chief characteristic is, as he put it in somewhat vulgar Cockney English, which is sort of his background, God bless. He can't help that. He says we are bloody lazy. We are bloody lazy. That's what we are, you know. But we have a wonderful way of dressing up that laziness with all kinds of abstractions, you know. Oh, I don't have to do this. I don't have to do that. I don't have to pray. I don't have to meditate. I don't have to introduce any kind of changes into my life, into my lifestyle. I don't have to be compassionate. Why? Because I've got the abstraction in my head. That's not all that's important. Some abstract concept. I've got it. I've got it. What have you got? You got the very thing that is deceiving you. You have the deceiver in your mind. You have Mara in your mind. The architect, you see, the architect of abstractions. We have a tendency to approach these potentially liberating systems in an abstract way, but we shouldn't. And in this case too, I think it's much better if we become aware of the fact that there is an opposition, there is an architect. Now, you don't have to make a Satan out of it. You don't have to make some kind of a demonology out of it. But there is something working against us. George Gurdjieff, for instance, Georgy Ivanovich Gurdjieff, you know, had some. Well, he sort of made a science fiction kind of explanation for it, which of course his followers take literally. What else? But maybe it's better than taking it abstractly. You know, Gurdjieff said that there's these beings on the moon, and they are sort of like space vampires, and they are using our energy, and in order to do that, they have to keep us in at the sort of minimal level of functioning of our consciousness. And they implanted some kind of psychic implant into us, to which he gave the magnificent name of Kunda buffer. And this Kunda buffer keeps us from becoming what we really ought to become. And so we have this to work against. Well, while some people don't really consider this a metaphor, I think it definitely is a metaphor. And if it's a metaphor, it's a Gnostic metaphor, because there is something inside of us that fights against our own freedom, and that contravenes and sabotages the majority of our efforts in the direction of freedom, and does a wonderful job of it, because it's in our minds. The Kunda buffer is not in our navel or in our spine or wherever. I don't know where Georgie boy put it, but it's in our minds, and so. These are important considerations in my view, both in Buddhism and definitely and very overtly and openly in Gnosticism.